of the sacrifices. So tell me first about the burnt offering. That's the first one. What do you remember about it? Back in chapter 1. I know some of you are like 3 weeks ago.
It's a sacrifice for atonement.
Yes, and for the broad picture of atonement. So we're going to get other aspects of atonement today, but the broad understanding of atonement, that's what's covered by the burnt offering. What else about the burnt offering?
The entire offering was burnt up on the altar.
Yes. So all of it goes up in smoke. What else?
It had to be a male without blemish.
Yes. And there were, well, what kinds of animals? Cattle, sheep, or a bird, right? Or bird, goat. Yeah, right. So why the difference? Because it's graduated based on, probably it's based on financial situation, right? So you don't have to bring the most valuable animal that you own, but there's this idea that God makes the burnt offering accessible to people who have different financial situations. Okay. Remind me just about a little bit about the process. What do you do first?
They put their hand on your head.
Why?
And then, because you're giving of yourself.
So you're identifying
So you're
yourself with the
identifying
animal.
yourself with the animal.
That's right, which is one of the reasons why it matters that it's blameless. Not the only reason, but one of the reasons.
I read that the sin goes from the person into the animal.
That's true of the scapegoat,
The scapegoat.
but not of the other sacrifices. Yeah.
What
So-
goes into the animal?
Like, say I'm the big sinner and I have the animal.
Oh, the sin goes into the
Lay my
animal.
hands there and then
Okay.
they just like go
Right.
to the animal.
So when we talk about the Day of Atonement and you see the scapegoat, the high priest puts his hand on the head of the scapegoat and symbolically transfers the sins of the nation to the scapegoat and then sends it out into the wilderness. But the other regular sacrifices, the idea is that you're identifying yourself with this animal and then the animal dies in your place. And the reason that it's blameless, of course, is because it's foreshadowing somebody else who's going to die in your place, right, for the penalty that you deserve. Okay, and then slaughter it.
Then they slaughter
Right.
it, and they sprinkle the blood on the altar.
That's today.
They
They splash it against the sides of the altar, right?
Right, that's
Although
right.
some of your translations might say sprinkle, but actually the word means to dash it or to splash it, so yeah, okay, I get what you're
That's
saying.
what I mean.
Yes, okay. And then, then they burned up the whole rest of the animal.
And
Okay.
this is all by the door of the tabernacle of meeting.
Yeah, so inside the courtyard where the big altar is, that's right. Okay, now the grain offering, tell me just generally what's the grain offering for? Do you remember?
It's also called a peace offering.
Yes, peace offering's the next one.
Oh, okay.
So the grain offering, yeah, the fellowship and the peace offering, that's the same thing. The grain offering is for thanksgiving, tribute, right, dedication, loyalty. It's an expression of loyalty to the covenant king. And it usually accompanies a burnt offering. So, do you remember what's included in it? What do you bring?
Flour, oil, and frankincense.
Right. Flour, oil, frankincense, salt. We talked about how there should be nothing that symbolizes anything that rots or goes bad, right? But the salt preserves it. You can bring it raw or you can cook it. But all of those are brought as tribute. Okay, now let's talk about the fellowship offering or the peace offering. How is it different from the burnt offering? Well, what is it? What's the symbolism of that offering?
You can have a male or female animal.
Right, because it's not as valuable. It's important, but it doesn't have the same prominence as the burnt offering. So you can bring a different kind of animal. And what did you say, Lindsay?
Thankfulness. I was getting mixed up with the grain.
Okay.
I was saying the grain was thankfulness.
And there is a sense in which grain is, expressing thankfulness or praise or tribute, but the fellowship offering, then you're coming and, well, what do you do with it? What happens to the fellowship offering? You share it, right? So there's a portion of it that you take out, remember the fat, the internal organs, because that's the best part of the meat. You give that to the Lord, that gets burned up on the offering. The priest gets his portion, that shows up later in chapter 7, and then you share the rest of it. You bring your friends and your family and you get the rest of the meat, you sit down and you have a meal together. Why does that matter? That God includes that kind of offering?
Well, the atonement covers our sins,
Mhm.
and until our sins are covered, we
Why not just stop at atonement?
Well, because the whole point of having our sins covered is so that we can have fellowship with God.
That's right. I think there are a lot of Americans who think the whole point of atonement is so that you get freedom to sin more.
There you
Right?
go.
But it's not. The purpose of atonement is that you have fellowship with God, which is why then you have a fellowship offering that pictures you sitting down in the courtyard of the tabernacle or wherever it's ceremonially clean and having a meal with God. You're invited to sit at his table because the whole point of atonement is to get you into fellowship, relationship. Okay, now, that review is important because you're going to see some of those elements then show up again as some things are going to be the same and some things are going to be very different in the Chapter 4, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he must bring to the Lord a young bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He is to present the bull at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. He is to lay his hand on its head and slaughter it before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and carry it into the tent of meeting. He is to dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle some of it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary. The priest shall then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The rest of the bull's blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of the burnt offering at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He shall remove all the fat from the bull of the sin offering, the fat that covers the inner parts or is connected to them, both kidneys with the fat on them near the loins and the covering of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys, just as the fat is removed from the ox sacrificed as a fellowship offering. Then the priest shall burn them on the altar of burnt offering, but the hide of the bull and all its flesh, as well as the head and legs, the inner parts and offal, that is all the rest of the bull, he must take outside the camp to a place ceremonially clean, where the ashes are thrown, and burn it in a wood fire on the ash heap. If the whole Israelite community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though the community is unaware of the matter, they are guilty. When they become aware of the sin they committed, the assembly must bring a young bull as a sin offering and present it before the tent of meeting. The elders of the community are to lay their hands on the bull's head before the Lord, and the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. Then the anointed priest is to take some of the bull's blood into the tent of meeting. He shall dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle it before the Lord 7 times in front of the curtain. He is to put some of the blood on the horns of the altar that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He shall remove all the fat from it and burn it on the altar, and do with this bull just as he did with the bull for the sin offering. In this way the priest shall make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. Then he shall take the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. This is the sin offering for the community. When a leader sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the commands of the Lord, his God, he is guilty. When he is made aware of the sin he committed, he must bring as his offering a male goat without defect. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and slaughter it at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered before the Lord. It is a sin offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall burn all the fat on the altar as he burned the fat of the fellowship offering. In this way the priest will make atonement for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven. If a member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, he is guilty. When he is made aware of the sin he committed, he must bring as his offering for the sin he committed a female goat without defect. He is to lay his hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. Then the priest is to take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. In this way the priest will make atonement for him, and he will be forgiven. If he brings a lamb as a sin offering, he is to bring a female without defect. He is to lay his hand on its head and slaughter it for a sin offering at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the lamb of the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar on top of the offerings made to the Lord by fire. In this way the priest will make atonement for him for the sin he has committed, and he will be forgiven. Okay, how does chapter 4 begin? In verses 1 and 2.
is forbidding any of the Lord's commands.
Now, that's a very different way to start the chapter. That's completely different from the way we've seen the other sacrifices start, and that's important. So here's the thing, the way that the chapters are structured, it groups the sacrifices, the first three sacrifices together. So those first three, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, those are grouped together because they're all voluntary sacrifices. You can bring them or not. There are particular occasions where if you want to participate, this is the offering you bring, but they're voluntary. Now we get to the last two sacrifices, which are not voluntary, in the sense that these sacrifices deal with very specific kinds of sins. And if you want to participate in anything at the tabernacle, you have to bring these offerings. So they're different. They're different from the first three, this one and the one that comes later in chapter 5. And you notice where the earlier chapters were organized around the description of the animal, now we get the sin suddenly mentioned, and we're going to talk more about the sin next week, because in chapter 5, the sin sort of takes precedence right there in the middle of the description of this offering. Okay, now, this chapter deals with what's typically called a sin offering. That's how it's normally translated. That's how my translation translates it. Some of yours probably do too. And that term, sin offering, it isn't wrong, but it's a little too general. And that's going to make things confusing later on. And here's why. I don't know if you've ever read through Leviticus and gotten to chapters where it talks about a woman having a baby, and then she has to bring a sin offering. And you think, why do you have to bring a sin offering? Because you have a baby. I mean, having a baby isn't a sin. Or then you get to some of the later chapters where there are skin diseases. You want to be purified from a skin disease, you have to bring a sin offering. Why do you have to bring a sin offering? It's not a sin to have a skin disease. The thing is, the sin offering is more specifically a purification offering. And so it does double duty. The purification offering is used to deal with both physical impurity, which is not a sin, and spiritual impurity, which is. And that's why when you get to those later chapters, this is the sacrifice you bring for things like skin diseases and childbirth, not because they're sins, but because they cause physical impurity. Now, when I say physical impurity, what I mean is ritual impurity, and we'll talk more about that later. But the reason that God puts both of those things under one sacrifice is because he uses physical impurity as a metaphor for sin. So you deal with them both the same way, not because childbirth and skin diseases are sinful, but because there are things about physical impurity that he uses as illustrations to communicate things about sin. Okay, now let's work through this just a little bit. So, for the Israelites, sin's defiling effects made an impact, not only on the sinner, but also on people associated with the sinner. So sin has a polluting effect. And that pollution doesn't affect just the person who does it, it affects the people around them. Okay, now, I used to work at an elementary school, and when flu season came, we would always talk to the kids about germs. Well, one of the ways that you talk about something you can't see is to give people an illustration of something they can. So we would take glitter, for example. And we'd say to the kids, you put your hands in glitter, right? And then you wipe it off, done, right? Except no. So you put your hands then on the table, now there's glitter on the table. You touch the person next to you, now they've got glitter on their sleeve. You touch the wall, now there's glitter on the wall. The next person who comes along puts their hands on the table, now they've got glitter on their hands. They wipe their hands on their pants, they've got glitter on their pants. They sit down on a chair, there's glitter on the chair, right? I mean, how easy is it to spread glitter all over the place? And we use that as an illustration for germs, right? Okay, so then you think the same way about the flu. You can't see it, but you sneeze, you put your hands down, the next person who comes along, I mean, you know how the story goes. Leviticus does that kind of thing in talking about sin. There are metaphors that Leviticus uses to communicate this idea that sin is not something that you do in isolation and it doesn't go any further. Sin has a polluting effect. It pollutes the place where you are, it pollutes the people that you come in contact with, and it spreads like crazy. Now that's an interesting way to think about sin, and we'll keep talking about that as we go through Leviticus. There's a lot of nuance in Leviticus about how it is that sin affects other people. It's not like dirt that you just wipe off. It's something that impacts people differently. Or let me give you a different metaphor for it. So one of the commentators said in Leviticus, sin is it's like dishonor. So for example, when a child does something wrong, they bring dishonor not only on themselves, but also on their family, and especially on their parents. There's a polluting effect of sin that dishonors the people around them. In a similar way, Israelites who committed certain wrongs brought a defiling dishonor on themselves, on their nation, and on their God. And that dishonor clung to the Lord's tabernacle. Just as the dishonor of a child's wrong clings to the home of a parent. It was kind of like an unholy dust that arose from their act and settled on the Lord's sanctuary. And how is it to be removed? This section provides the answer. It was removed by the purification offerings, cleansing blood. The way to get rid of the pollution that's caused by sin is through the sacrifice, through the cleansing of the blood of the sacrifice. Okay, now, we're going to keep talking about that, but right now, let's just switch for a minute and talk about unintentional sin. I know that got your attention when you read unintentional sin or inadvertent sin. How do you sin unintentionally?
In many ways.
Okay, give me a couple examples.
Not doing the good you should do.
Which is it's like a sin of omission, right? Okay, we're going to get to that next week. Beginning of chapter 5, we're going to get to sins of omission, which is connected to this. Okay, what else? What other ways could you sin
You're
unintentionally?
unaware of breaking the law.
Right, and that could happen either because you don't know what the law is, or because you know it, but you don't know that you're breaking it, right? So for example, if you buy marijuana in Colorado, and you bring it into Wyoming, and you get stopped by the cops on I-80, and he's like, you got marijuana in your car, and you're like, well, so, right? You don't get off the hook because you didn't know it was illegal in Wyoming, right? You're guilty even though you don't know the law. So that's one way you could sin unintentionally, is by not knowing the law. Or take, for example, the speed limit in a school zone. Everybody knows that the speed limit in a school zone is 20 miles an hour. But it could be that you're driving through a town you haven't been in before, you're distracted by something, and you miss the sign for the school zone. So you know what the law is, but you don't realize that you're breaking it because you didn't see the sign. If you get pulled over by the cop, it's not going to be enough to say, what school zone, right? I mean, you're guilty even though you didn't realize that you were breaking the law. So there's a couple of ways that you can sin unintentionally. But sinning unintentionally doesn't mean that you're not guilty. You are, and you still have to deal with the consequences of unintentional sin. There was this one commentator who said, I feel like I'm in an inadvertent sin just waiting to happen. And I was like, yeah, me too. Okay, now, if you're like me, you might have some questions at this point, because there's an awful lot of our sin that doesn't fall into that category, right? There's a lot of it that's not unintentional. And that's important, and we're going to talk about it, just not right now, because we'll come back to that as we continue through Leviticus. We'll get other kinds of sins and nuances about sin. But now, let's continue with the ritual of the sacrifice for an unintentional sin. Okay, so what instructions does the Lord give about this offering? First in verse 3.
It's for if the anointed priest sins,
Mm-hmm.
he offers a young bull without blemish.
Yes. Now, did you notice that this section was divided into parts? Did you notice what the different sections are based on? Who's doing it? The status of the person who sins, right? Why do you think it starts with the high priest, and your translation might say the anointed priest, which is a way of talking about the high priest? Why do you think this section starts with the high priest?
He's the leader.
He goes before God.
Because, yeah, everybody
The
looks up to
mediator.
a mediator. Yeah.
That's right. And did you notice what it says right after it mentions if the anointed priest sins? What comes right after that?
He brings guilt on the people.
Oh, there's a polluting effect of his sin on the rest of the nation because of who he is. Okay, now why would that be? Because if he's the one who mediates between the people and the Lord, his impurity makes their sacrifices impure, right? I mean, it's kind of like if you go to court and you have a lousy lawyer who gets on the wrong side of the judge as the client, you're going to pay the price for that, right? if the high priest is impure and he spreads his impurity around, how can he mediate for the whole rest of the nation? So he is one person in the nation whose sin is really important, and it has to be dealt with, because if he's on the wrong side of God, there's no way for the rest of the people in the nation to be on the right side of it. So his sin has to be dealt with. Okay, and then he brings a young bull without defect for the purification offering. Again, like we talked about with the burnt offering, this would be the most valuable animal they have. So this is a serious sacrifice that he brings. What does he do with it in verse 4?
He lays his hand on the head of the bull.
Yeah, so he presents it, puts his hand on it, identifies himself with it, and slaughters it. Now, so far, that should sound familiar, because it's, to this point, it's the same as the ritual for the burnt offering and for the fellowship offering. But then, it starts to get interesting, right? So, when you get to verse 5, then what happens? Now things change.
Dips his finger in the blood,
Mhm.
and he sprinkles some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. This is the New King James Version.
So he's inside the tabernacle,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Okay, so he takes the bull's blood, carries it into the tabernacle, dips his finger in, sprinkles it 7 times. Why 7? Because that's the number of completion, right? So there's this symbol of complete, thorough cleansing, and he does it before the Lord, before the veil, in order to acknowledge that the sin was against him. And then, what does he do?
Put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense. Now, that's the New King James Version. ESV calls it the altar of incense.
Yeah,
So it's he's within the tabernacle, and now he's putting blood on that. If you've looked at your diagrams, he's putting blood on that altar where they burn incense all the time.
right. So he's in the holy place, and the altars, both the incense altar and the burnt offering altar outside, they had these projections on the 4 corners that stood up. They were like horns, right? Because there were these projections that were on the corners, and so he just dabs blood on each of those 4 corners, because it's symbolic of purifying the whole thing. If you get all 4 corners, it's like you purify the entire altar. And why is he doing it there? Because this is his workplace. That's why. This is the place that's made impure by his sin, is the place where he's working all the time, and that would be the holy place that's inside the tabernacle. But he doesn't go all the way into the most holy place, because that only happens once a year on the Day of Atonement. Okay, so in this way he cleans the Lord's house, so to speak, by removing his impurity from the Lord's dwelling place, since this is where his daily work is done. And then when he finishes that purification ritual, he has to dispose properly of the rest of the blood. So since things were given to the Lord by means of the altar and the blood was the Lord's, he takes the rest of the blood back outside and he pours it out at the base of the altar for burnt offering. Then what does he do in 8 to 12?
Then he takes the fat and the kidneys and the liver, and he burns them on the altar of the burnt offering. So he burns them outside.
Right. And this is just like with the fellowship offering, because that's the portion that belongs to the Lord. Now, normally with the rest of the fellowship offering, then the meat would get divided out. He would eat some of it, the worshipers would eat some of it. What happens to it here?
Consumed.
Where?
Outside.
Yeah, so he has to take all the rest of it and burn it. He takes it outside of the tabernacle courtyard and burns it actually outside of the camp to a place that's ceremonially clean, and he burns it on the fire on the ash heap. Now, why is he not allowed to eat the meat of this offering? Because actually, we'll get to purification offerings in a minute where the priest is allowed to eat the meat. So if it's a leader or a layperson, he's allowed to eat the meat. But he's not allowed to eat it here because it's his own purification offering. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest. I mean, he can't profit from his own purification offering. One of the commentators I read said, for the priest or his family members to eat the meat would mean that he's in some way profiting comparable to a person who robs a bank, turns himself in, and then gets the reward. Right? You can't be guilty and then get rewarded for it. So that's why when the priest makes a sacrifice for his own sin, he cannot eat the meat of his own purification offering. So what do you do with it? He takes it outside the camp and disposes of it in the way that the Lord says.
Sally, where did how would a priest go about getting a bull without defect? Because they don't have their own ownership of stuff, right?
They have land where they can have animals.
They can have their own.
Yes.
Okay.
They don't have, and not in the sense that they don't have the kind of land that all the rest of the tribes do, but they're given sort of little parcels of land among all of the different tribes so that they're spread out among the nation, because part of their job is to teach the people in all of these different places. And the areas where they live, they are allowed to have, you know, a flock or a little herd of cattle or whatever. Probably you wouldn't have very much, but there would be space for you to own a few animals and maybe to raise a few.
And might some of these animals be part of the tithe offering that's given to them?
Yes, because people would bring the firstborn animals. That's, yes, you would bring that kind of stuff to the temple as well, to the tabernacle or the temple. So it might be as well that they get some of their herds from the animals that people bring. Yeah. Okay, now, what are the instructions that come next in 13 to 21?
For the whole Israelite community
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and how we deal with the sin they committed.
yes. Okay, now, how would the whole Israelite community sin unintentionally? There's actually an example of this in the book of Joshua, where the Lord had forbidden the people of Israel from making a treaty with any of the nations in Canaan. And so there was this particular group of people who were pretty savvy. They realized what was happening, and they were called the Gibeonites. And so they came to Joshua, and they deceived him into thinking that they weren't from Canaan. They made him think that they had come from a long ways away, and then they asked him to make a treaty with them. And instead of doing some investigation, he said yes. And so he entered into a treaty with them. Okay, now you could look at that and say, well, that's just Joshua's fault. But because he's acting in an official capacity for Israel, the entire nation now is guilty of being in a treaty with a nation they shouldn't be, right? I mean, it's the same for us, like if our president enters into a treaty with another country, we as a country are on the hook for whatever it is that he did. Well, Israel is now on the hook for this covenant, this treaty that Joshua makes with the Gibeonites that he shouldn't have. So that's something that was an unintentional sin. He got deceived, and yet he's still guilty, and the nation is guilty because of that. So if the whole nation then is guilty, basically it's the same as with the high priest, but there is a difference. Who is it who comes as on the part of the worshiper in this sacrifice?
The elders.
The elders. So this would probably be, I would guess, people who represent the tribes. Maybe there's a leader from all the different tribes or from all the prominent families. And so when they bring this one offering for the nation, it's important that all of these elders come and they all put their hand on the head of the animal, right? Because it's the whole nation now identifying with this animal who's now going to stand in their place. So they come as representatives of the assembly of people. They bring a bull as the purification offering presented at the tent of meeting, identify the nation with the animal, and the rest of this ritual follows the same ritual as with the high priest. And again, the high priest, everything gets burned up the way that it did before because the high priest is part of the community. So he can't benefit from this offering any more than he could from an offering for his own sin. Okay, now, what about the third set of instructions in verses 22 to 26?
A leader or a ruler
Yes.
is the subject.
Right. So this could be the king, it could be an elder, it could be someone who's a judge, it could be anybody who functions as a leader in the community. Now, if he sins unintentionally and breaks the law of the Lord, realizes he's guilty, what does he do?
They bring the goat, a male without defect.
Okay, now that's interesting, because the animal just changed, right? So we had a bull for the previous two offerings, but now there's the option of bringing a less valuable animal. Why?
He's only one man. He's not the high priest over everyone. He's not the entire congregation.
That's right. And he has influence, but not the kind of influence that the high priest would have, right? So there's the difference in the sacrifice is a reflection of the difference in his status. So he has the option of bringing something that's not as valuable. Now, that's not to say the seriousness of the sin itself is relative, but the consequences of his sin are different. So, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So, then what happens when he brings his offering?
The priest, after the animal is killed, the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering. So is that the outside?
Yes. So
Altar?
that's right. So in this case, the priest doesn't go into the tent of meeting. He stays in the courtyard, and he only cleanses the outside altar by putting blood on the four horns. Why? Because the leader wouldn't go into the tabernacle. That's why. He's cleansing the place where the worshiper would have gone. So when it's something that covers him or the other priests as part of the nation, then he goes all the way into well, not all the way, but he goes into the tabernacle. But when it's just a leader or a layperson, he only cleanses what's on the outside, because they wouldn't have gone into the tabernacle. There's a sense in which the differences are due to the fact that, the leader's sin is serious, but there's a more valuable animal called for, and a sort of going further into the house of the Lord to do the cleansing that comes from the high priest or from the community as a whole. And in this case too, you notice the fat and the internal organs are burned as an offering to the Lord, but the remainder of the meat isn't burned. Now, it's not described right here. It's just said that they do the same as they do with the fellowship offering. We know from chapter 6 what that means is that the priest can use the rest of the meat. So in this case, the priest can actually take the rest of the meat and eat it. We'll get to
Wait a
that.
minute, back up. Where did it,
Yeah, I don't see that.
So it says, he shall burn all the fat on the altar as he burns the fat of the fellowship offering. That's verse 26. Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Right? Okay, so
Okay.
he treats that the same as the fellowship offering. Now then, what does he do with the rest of the meat? It doesn't mention
It
right
doesn't
here
say.
what he does with it, except it doesn't say that he takes it outside the camp and burns it.
okay,
It just leaves it unsaid.
okay.
But we know from chapter 6 that he treats the meat of this offering the same as he would as a fellowship offering, which means he gets the rest of it. Well, I shouldn't say the same as a fellowship offering, because the worshiper doesn't get any of it. Because again, you can't profit from your own offering, from your own purification offering. But chapter 6 will tell us the rest of the meat of the purification offering, the priest eats himself.
Priest gets to eat.
Yeah, and he can share it with his family. Okay, and then what's the last section of instructions in 27 to 35?
Common people.
Yes.
Unintentional.
That's a good way to put it. I was thinking peons. And I was like, that's not the word I want, but I can't think of what.
My
Yes.
Bible says common people.
Common people, that's a good way to put it, the lay people, that's right. Okay, so tell me about this one. What's different here?
It's a female.
Yeah, so now you can bring a female goat or sheep instead of a male. Again, it's a less valuable offering than the leader would bring, than the community would bring, or than the high priest would bring. So common people can bring a female animal for this offering, and it shows the difference in the status of the person. Now, otherwise, this sacrifice is the same as the one before it. So the priest cleanses the altar outside of the tabernacle. He burns the fat and the internal organs as an offering to the Lord, And chapter 6 tells us that the priest gets the rest of the meat. And in this way, he makes atonement for the person's sin, and they're forgiven. Okay, what kinds of things are emphasized in those instructions? How is it similar to the burnt offering and the fellowship offering, and how is it different?
Well, the offering is blood,
Yep,
sacrifice, death.
yes. You're still identifying yourself with the animal, right, when you lay your hand on its head. It still has to die, yep. What else?
The dispensation of the blood?
What do you mean by that?
Well, some of it was sprinkled on the altar, the finger.
Right.
And I forget what the other, then they pour it outside.
Yes. So that's the thing that's really different in this offering with the purification offering is the use of the blood. So they all involve blood, but the purification offering uses it in a totally different way because there's the symbolism of cleansing everything that would come in contact with the worship.
This is the first time we've seen, you've got the outside courtyard, and up until this point, everything has happened in that outside courtyard. At this point, some of that, the killing of the animal happens at the entrance into the tent of meeting. So at this point, he's taking blood in, but still not going into the holiest of holy. But, that blood is going into the tent of meeting.
Yeah. And that there is one day a year when the blood of the purification offering goes all the way in, and that's the Day of Atonement. Yeah.
Is there, back to verse 11, is there any significance there? They mention the hide in this one. Is there any significance to that, or is it just that it's the rest of the animal that's burnt?
Well, so in the burnt offering, we'll see when we get to chapter 6, with the burnt offering, the priest gets the hide.
Okay.
So it's significant that when it's a purification offering for him, he doesn't. The hide gets burned along with everything else.
Okay.
Again, because he can't profit in any way from an offering for his own sin.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you see the similarities where it's like there's an echo of the burnt offering, there's an echo of the fellowship offering. That's important because atonement and the restoration of fellowship are both relevant when it comes to violations of God's law. It's like those offerings are sort of included in the purification offering. But even though there are echoes of those previous sacrifices, the emphasis of the purification offering is on the use of the blood for cleansing from sin. And it's so interesting that it switches from giving different offerings based on your financial situation to giving different offerings based on your status. Let's talk about that for a minute. Why does that matter? Why do you think that he provides different offerings based on the status of a person and how much authority or leadership you have?
Because of the effects of the sin, of the people that you influence, maybe.
That's right. How much impact, how different is it, the impact of a leader's sin than of somebody who's just a common person?
Well, that affects everybody.
That's right.
The leaders affect everybody.
That's right. There's a polluting effect that is different based on how much influence or authority you have, right? And we can see that worked out in all kinds of ways. You can see it in a family. The sin of a father has a different impact on a family than the sin of a toddler, right? You can see it in a business. If the CEO gets on the wrong side of the law, that's different from somebody who, got hired last week. It's true in government, right? The sins of leaders affect the people who are under them, and you definitely see it in the church, don't you?
Yes.
Where the sins of leaders pollute the things that go on around them. They pollute the church, they pollute people. It has a huge impact on the people around them. And it's so important that when we're thinking about purification from sin, to realize all sin makes us equally guilty before God, but not all sin has equal consequences. And Leviticus does not deal with all sin the same. It does in the sense that something has to die. In order to be atonement, There has to be a death. And yet, at the same time, there's a difference in the way the sacrifices function based on the status of the person, because the consequences of sin are not the same for the high priest as they are for someone who's a layperson. Why does that matter for us? Because we're Americans, and we like to be equal, right? I mean, I've heard people say, you don't hold leaders to a higher standard in the church. That's not fair.
It's scriptural though.
It is, and why does it matter in Scripture?
Because they're leading the people, they're the shepherd, they're the caregiver and the overseer.
And so their sin has an impact on all those people that they lead, right? And that's something, even when you get to the pastoral epistles, that's something Paul says you have to take very seriously. Leaders are held to a higher standard because of the influence that they have on other people in the church, and because of the possibility, the greater possibility of bringing disrepute to the name of the Lord, right? That's definitely more of an issue if you have a leader sinning than somebody who's, now, that's not to say the sins of the lay people don't matter. Of course they do. But they don't pollute in the same way as the sin of a leader. And that's really important. I was thinking about this when I went through this passage, because there was a well-known, well, I was going to say I don't want to throw him under the bus, but maybe I should just say his name. You know, I used to read stuff by Ravi Zacharias, who had this amazing apologetics ministry. He had an amazing testimony about converting from Hinduism. It was just, I loved reading his stuff. He was so reasoned. His books were so great. They were scriptural. They were just good arguments. And then after he dies, it comes out he was involved in this really destructive sexual sin against, this handful of women. Well, then you think, okay, I've got books of his. I've never met him. I don't have anything to do with his family, his ministry, any of that, but I've got his books. What am I going to do with them now? I can't put him on the book table at a Bible conference, right? I'm not going to give them away to other people. I can't even take them down to the used bookstore and donate them, because what if somebody picks it up, reads it, and then looks him up on the internet? So his sin, which has no direct impact on me, has polluted everything he did, right? Because now it's not just that, the books haven't changed. The content of the book is exactly the same, and yet I'm not even going to read it anymore, and I'm not going to pass it on to anybody else either. And it's not just the books that he wrote, it's the ministry that he had. So now it's tainted his ministry. All the people who worked for him, it's tainted them. There was one guy who had worked for him who he was a Muslim who converted to Christianity, and he had worked for him, and then he had died too. He has this amazing testimony. Well, they reprinted his biography, his autobiography. They reprinted it and scrubbed all the mention of Ravi Zacharias and everything he was associated with. Why? Because that taints this guy, even though he had nothing to do with his sin. And that's one guy. I mean, just think again about how the pollution of leaders' sins affects people in ways that you wouldn't even think of. And it's huge. And Leviticus takes that very seriously, because Leviticus says if you're going to presume to be a leader, you have to consider the fact that your sin pollutes in ways that have a huge impact on other people. And particularly when it comes to spiritual things. I mean, it's interesting to me that the first person mentioned is not the king. The first person mentioned is the high priest, because it's in the spiritual leadership that the polluting effect of sin has a huge impact on other people.
There's a huge hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So Kelly, sin is sin. If it's unintentional, if the leader has misunderstood something and taught it in error, as opposed to what the reference you just made in terms of a sexual, he's engaged in obviously a blatant sin.
Right.
Does it matter?
It matters because, Ravi Zacharias is a difficult situation because he died before he was confronted, publicly confronted about that. But here's the thing, the priest, for an unintentional sin, he's not disqualified from ministry because of what he did. I mean, he brings a purification offering, he offers it, and he carries on in his work after he's done the purification offering. It does matter what kind of sin it is. And we're going to get to that later too. There are different categories of sin based on whether they're intentional or unintentional, and based on whether they're intentional and non-defiant, or intentional and defiant. Those are all different categories of sin within Leviticus. The sacrificial system treats them differently. There are some sins there's no atonement for, which sounds a little disturbing to us as a church, but there are some sins there's no atonement for, which we'll get to later. But it depends on who does it, but also what the sin is, how it is that the sacrificial system deals with it.
But I'm like with Marilyn, Christ died for every sin that we've committed.
Mm-hmm.
And Rabbi Zacharias, he sinned, we all sin.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean the Lord didn't use him?
No,
Why are they wiping his name off then?
because of the polluting effect of that sin and how it taints.
But all our
Everything
sin
else.
pollutes.
Yes,
And we're forgiven.
that's right. That's right.
And I just remember Amy Grant, when she got divorced, the Christian radios quit playing her music.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, really? A lot of people get divorced.
So there's some wisdom that we have to think through in these issues, where we don't say, if you sin and you're a public figure, you're out. That's not what we're saying. But we are saying there are some sins that you can be forgiven of, but you can't continue in the position that you have.
There's still the consequence.
There
of-
is.
Even though there's the forgiveness.
That's right.
Where is it that, I just keep thinking, like, there's somewhere that says the sins of the father are visited in 2 or 3 generations or whatever that says, and I used to, as I started to have a head knowledge, but before I had any kind of a relationship, like, I used to think that was so horrible that God would visit the sins of the father on, and now, of course, it makes sense, like, whether it was intentional or unintentional, those consequences still, the consequences of my sin will still affect my children, even though they had nothing to do with it, even though
Until it's dealt with, though.
well, yes, I'm forgiven of my sins, right? But the consequences of my sins are still going to affect my children. They're still going to be there.
And it's an important distinction, because when you think about leaders, and you think about what Paul says, for example, in 1 Timothy about leaders, a leader can be forgiven of any sin and restored to Christian fellowship. That doesn't mean he can continue as a pastor. You can be forgiven but disqualified from that ministry.
Okay, so I look at our own pastor and his father and the sin that came in. Do you know what I'm saying? However, our pastor now has taken that past sin and grown from it. Somebody help me out here. And so it's like it stopped.
But I think that that's how we see the Lord work through sinful people. Like, I mean, his testimony is so because of that situation, he can be who he is and provide the ministry that he can provide because of that. It's not,
So the consequences, what Satan meant for evil, God
exactly, yep.
means for good.
Yep.
And when we deal with something and turn it over, he can make beauty out of ashes, right? I'm not trying to take away from what you're saying, because I think it's so important. I mean, I see some pastors who have sinned, and they're back as a pastor again, and they shouldn't be.
But that doesn't mean that there can't be redemptive things that come out of that experience.
Absolutely.
Of course there can. Of course you can be restored, and there can be redemption there. There can be all kinds of amazing things that God does in a situation like that. But there are certain positions you're now disqualified from because of the impact that it has on others. Yeah. And let me just say, this is complicated, and it's not going to get easier next week. or the week after that, or the week after that. Leviticus is going to challenge our understanding of sin. And the longer that I've read through Leviticus, the more I've realized we have something of a superficial understanding of sin in the American church. And if you have a superficial understanding of sin, you have a superficial understanding of repentance and also of atonement. And some of it I'm having a hard time getting a hold of, and I know it's going to be challenging for all of us to actually just stop and rethink, okay, how do we think about sin? What are the kinds of metaphors that Leviticus uses, and do I really think through sin as pollution? Or we're going to get to something later where one of the commentators said sin is like acid. It corrupts and corrodes everything that it touches. I've been thinking on that for the last couple of weeks, just thinking, how does that work? What does that look like? How do you stop it? You know, like, yeah, there's a lot of heavy stuff about sin and sacrifice and repentance in Leviticus. So, I mean, if you struggle, it's okay. It's okay. And it's not, we're gonna work through these things as we keep going, but there's some complex stuff in Leviticus about sin and sacrifice. Donna, were you gonna say something?
Oh, just secret sin,
Oh,
that in your head, you know, you sin and think things that you shouldn't, or a man lusts after, you know, another man's wife or whatever. It happens, you know, but it's a secret. Nobody knows but God.
yeah. Now, when you think about the purification offering, I wonder if you see any connections to Jesus.
To what?
Jesus. Jesus.
Oh.
Sorry. It's okay, it's the Sunday school answer.
Oh, him.
Oh, him.
Sometimes we just don't say it loud enough, right? Jesus.
It makes me very thankful that I am on the post-Jesus side. When I look at this and the ritual that they had to go through and the necessity of actually killing an animal, you know. Makes me very thankful that I was born in 2,000 years later.
Yeah. And we'll come back to this next week, but you know that verse in 1 John, that famous one, 1 John 1:9.
That one?
If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us of all unrighteousness. Okay, right there is the background of the purification offering. What does it take for you to be purified? You confess your sin and then you rely on what the sacrifice that Jesus has made for you. Because the blood of Jesus does what the blood of bulls and goats never could. It actually changes you from the inside out. It doesn't just get dabbed on stuff with a symbolic cleansing. Like, well, you remember from last week, you drink it, right? There's that symbol in the Lord's Supper of actually taking it into yourself, ingesting it. Why? Because the life of Christ becomes yours. And it transforms you and cleans you from the inside out, which is what all the sacrifices are getting at. This foreshadow of what's coming with the final sacrifice of Jesus.
Do the Israelites still do these sacrifices? Do they still?
There's no temple, so no.
Okay.
we don't. I've heard that some of the Orthodox Jews have some other kinds of ceremonies they do in place of this, but I don't know exactly what it is. But no, there's no temple.
That's why there's such controversy over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where there's it's an Islamic structure now, mosque, and the Jews are waiting for that to go away so that they can rebuild the temple, and that's their restoration to fellowship with God.
Except that it's a rejection of fellowship with God, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes,
it is.
So what is your sense, like, just logistically, were there, multiple sacrifices each day that the priest had to deal with? Was this, like, it just feels like there's so much blood, like they would be constantly, they themselves would be constantly unclean because of all of the blood and the death. Like, how would that?
There's a lot of the practical stuff I don't know.
Okay.
And I think the Israelites understood it all because this was the cultural air
Right,
that they
sure.
breathed, right? They totally knew what was going on. But the more I read in the Old Testament, the more I have this impression that it was typical for families to only come rarely. So to come like once a year with your whole family and to offer sacrifices that time when you come. Now the men would come, they were supposed to come for the 3 annual festivals. But, you know, we're gonna get to some other things later where you think, okay, if you have to bring a sacrifice for that, you'd be bringing a sacrifice every week or every month.
Every day.
Every day, right?
Yeah.
And there are people who live far enough away from the temple or the tabernacle, that's not even physically possible for them to come to the tabernacle every month. And the indication in the Old Testament is that they didn't. It sounds like I'm kind of going on out on a limb right here, so I might change my mind after I keep studying, but it sounds to me like you could come, you know, one time a year and you could bring a sacrifice, one sacrifice that would deal with your whole family, or one sacrifice that would deal with multiple sins. Like, so think about that even with what we just saw with the elders laying their hands on the head of the animal. You have one animal that represents all these people. My impression is that you could do that with a family as well. I could be wrong, but I think you can because, for example, with the story of Hannah I mentioned before, it actually says that their family only came once a year. And after she had Samuel, she didn't go again until he was old enough for him to leave him, for her to leave him there. So there was that, you know, that must have been at least 2, probably 3 years or more when she didn't go. So then when you go, you don't offer 2,000 sacrifices for all of the sins that you committed. My impression is that you could offer a purification sacrifice that would cover everything. A burnt offering that would cover your whole family. A grain offering that could represent all the people that you bring with you. That's my impression. I haven't read that in black and white, I just see that's indicated in
You've read a lot
the
of
narratives
black
of
and
the
white,
Old
though,
Testament.
it's easy.
But I was thinking the same thing, because you get to things later where, especially when you get to physical impurities, where you think,
Yeah.
well, you'd be bringing a sacrifice every other day, and how could you possibly do that? Nobody has that many animals, and who has that amount of time? I mean, you can't walk all the way across Israel, you know?
Well, and that's the thing, we have to remember, how many people left Egypt?
A lot, over 1 million,
You know,
I
they're
think.
thinking over 1 million, so let's look at that geographically, 1 million people, and there's one place they can do this. You know, I think it's hard for us in Lander, Wyoming, who live in a community of 8,000 people, to imagine 1 million people in this community. And just the geographic spread that involves.
And I have the impression when you would come, we'll see later, there's an order to the sacrifices where it goes purification, burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering. And my impression is that you could come with a whole family and offer a purification offering for your family, a burnt offering for your family, a grain offering for your family, and a fellowship
Like
offering.
all of them at one
That's,
time.
that's the impression I have, instead of every single person in the family offering a separate lamb. Because you see lots of places where one lamb serves for an entire family. You see that in the Passover, you see it on the Day of Atonement. And I just have the impression you could do that with families just in the regular purification offerings too. I could be wrong, but I don't see how else it's practically possible to have all those sacrifices for that many people. Yeah.
I have 2 questions, but maybe you've answered these, and I haven't been here. My attendance has been sporadic.
We've noticed.
How could they have so many perfect animals?
Oh.
Have you discussed that? Okay, I'm really confused about that. I don't understand that. And my second question is, have you discussed the red heifer?
No.
No.
Okay. Are you going to?
Is it in Leviticus?
I don't know where it is. I have heard
If it's
that
in
a lot.
Leviticus, yes. If it's not, probably not.
That is my question.
Enough other meat to chew on.
Yeah. So when you're talking about a perfect animal, You're talking about one that's not deformed
Or lame.
or lame, defective that
And
way.
we're probably talking about young animals.
Mhm.
We're not always talking about, although I had circled in here, one of the references in verse 10 was that it was an ox that was offered. And when I see ox, to me, that's
The biggest,
Yeah.
yes,
a
that's right.
big animal.
That's
so.
right. But, you know, you think, well, when I was driving here, I was thinking, it's calving season,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't be too hard to find a calf, you know, out in your field that's not lame or, and that's the idea, is that it's not defective. It could have spots on it or whatever, but it's not defective or lame in any way. And, you know, if you only come once a year, then it's possible, you know, to keep one of your animals, you know, to look after it well or something. But it's not that the animal has to be perfect, but it's that it can't be, yeah, defective in some way.
It can't be a reject.
That's right.
It's of more
Yes.
value if it's perfect.
That's right.
Boy, I'm thinking though, as you say that, you set this side, this animal, how much greater. I mean, you probably named it, right? I would.
With the Passover lamb, they were to take that lamb into their household.
Yeah, so for years, yeah.
What, 10 days or?
Or 2 weeks or something like that, yeah, I can't remember,
Yeah.
but you even think about stories where it talks about the fatted calf, right? What are they doing but putting a calf to the side and keeping it for a special occasion? And, you know, it might be that if you know on this day, you and your whole family are gonna go to the tabernacle, that you would prepare ahead of time, perhaps, to make sure that you have an appropriate animal to take with you. I don't know for sure, but that would be my guess.
It's Numbers 19, that's the red heifer.
we're not gonna-
Oh,
Numbers
I'm
19.
Oh, well.
Now we're all gonna
Numbers
go.
comes after- Numbers comes after Leviticus.
I know. That's why I came up at home.
All right, comments, anything else you want to add?
Hi, Linda, do we have an update from you?
No, he's back at District Heights.
Or you're back, he's back at Westwood Heights, okay.
He had a bad day yesterday. It's complicated because the brake's on the left side and the pacemaker's on the right side. And he's restricted for 4 weeks for movement with this arm until the muscle heals where they